I'm normally very skeptical of third-party lenses, so when Viltrox offered to send me their 16mm f1.8, I knew I had to take them up on their offer. So here's my first impressions of this lens after the first shoot. What's up, y'all? It's Project Photography back with another video, and today Nikon currently doesn't offer a fast wide-angle prime in their Nikon Z lenses, which is why having a Viltrox 16mm f1.8 could be a massive win for a lot of Nikon Z photographers, especially if you're a landscape photographer. Being able to have a fast aperture wide-angle lens is especially great for things like astrophotography or general wide-angle landscape photography. And so far, I've only been on one landscape shoot with this lens and found some really interesting results, especially when it comes to its vignetting performance. But just like any other review where a company sends me their product to take a look at, this is completely unbiased and the company is only seeing this video when it goes fully public. So with that being said, let's first talk about this lens's focal length, because this is a 16mm lens, and for most of my landscape photography wide angle, I'm normally shooting at a 14mm, and when I was shooting with this, I really couldn't tell the difference. I thought the images were really nice, being able to get essentially everything I want inside the frame at once, and I felt like it was wide enough to capture pretty much whatever composition that I wanted to craft. This was an incredibly comfortable focal length to shoot at. Even if I was shooting those foreground elements, I was still able to exaggerate it in the way that I wanted to. One thing you may not have noticed is that this is a prime lens, so obviously we don't have any zoom. And for me, majority of the times, I'm only using the wide angle side of things anyways. So that's why I feel like having a prime lens really isn't a big deal versus something like a zoom lens. And something that actually impressed me with this lens was its sharpness. It is a very sharp lens, even at a wide open aperture like f1.8. We're getting sharp images in the center as well as the corners, and it performed way better than I personally thought it would. And when I was taking a look at the MTF charts, that absolutely backed up what I was seeing with my photos. And honestly, I think that's a big plus for this lens when I thought, image quality may be an issue with this. But speaking of its aperture, we do have to talk about that because this is an f1.8 aperture. And honestly, I am glad that it does have this because especially if you're shooting things like astrophotography, being able to have as much light into the frame really allows you to have cleaner images overall. With a wide angle lens, that is an absolute win. My main issue though is that the vignetting at 1.8 and even throughout this lens's aperture is relatively significant. And I mean, yes, I do use filters on all of my wide angle lenses, but even without my filters, shooting at around f13, we were still getting a significant amount of vignetting, and that is kind of an issue for landscape photography. Generally speaking, you want your images to be as clean as possible, yes, when it comes to sharpness, but also for vignetting, because you don't want to have to clean up those corners in post-production. You want to make sure it looks good straight out of camera. And I personally have not shot astrophotography with this lens yet, but I can absolutely see how that's going to be a major issue when it comes to this lens, because when you're shooting astrophotography, yes, you want that fast aperture, but again, you also want to make sure it performs well in the corners when it comes to vignetting. You don't want the corners to look darker than the rest of the image. It's just not going to look as pleasant. So I think that's going to be a major obstacle that this lens will have to overcome, and especially if you're using it. That is a bit more work in post-production. Yes, you can clean it up, and honestly, I didn't really have an issue cleaning it up, but even when I did, it's still relatively noticeable. So I think that's something you definitely have to consider before picking up this lens. If the vignetting is an issue, this definitely could pose a problem for this lens. And obviously, this is something that I will need to test out more. But one of the best aspects about this lens is the design. First of all, we have an aperture ring on here, which is honestly really cool. And yes, a lot of the Nikon Z lenses, you're able to program one of the rings as a control ring, and you can use that for aperture. But a lot of the times I found myself just like randomly hitting it, and my aperture would go from like an f8 to like an f4 all of a sudden. So I never really used the control ring as an aperture ring because I just never found it that useful. But having a dedicated aperture ring on here is pretty sick, and the fact they're able to click it on or off is really cool, so that, for example, if you want to shoot video, you can de-click it so that it goes really smoothly between the apertures. But for photography, I like having the click on so I can see exactly where the aperture is. And just like the Nikon 24-70, we do have a display on here. It will show you things like the manual focus as well as the aperture. And of course, we have an AF/MS switch on here, which is really nice if you're, for me, let's just say shooting between video and then going back to stills to shoot landscapes. Having the AF/MS switch is nice to go between those really fast and very easily. And then below the AF/MS switch are two function buttons. Now the FN1 on top has this little like dimple here, and then the bottom one does not have that, so that's FN2. For me, I don't really use the function buttons on lenses because not all lenses have them. So I want to make sure there's a sense of continuity between all my lenses, so I'm not like adjusting until each lens every time I change it out. But if you like the function buttons, you can set these and program them to essentially whatever you want. I think if you program one of them to, let's just say, the zoom in magnification, that'd be really useful, especially when you're manual focusing. And something that I'm a big fan of when it comes to this lens is this metal construction. Pretty much the entire lens is made out of metal. There's only one part of here that's plastic, and that's kind of on the front surrounding the element. But other than that, it's all metal, and I love that. I think it's more durable, and I think it's gonna hold up in the long run. And we also get a metal mount. I think that's a great job when it comes to build quality in particular. But of course, this does make the lens a little heavier. So when it comes to weather resistance, this is a really interesting story because it says it's dust resistant, but not drip resistant. So I didn't see that on their website. So I think that's something that I definitely will need to like look at more, like how resistant is it to the elements? Because quite frankly, when you're using a wide angle lens for landscape photography, you're gonna be shooting by the ocean, in the desert, in the mountains, and places where there's gonna be a lot of elements that can get inside your lens and your camera gear, especially by the ocean. I mean, I'm getting slammed by water all the time. So that is something that I really need to be aware of, like how resistant is this to water in particular. And the last thing I want to mention is the 77mm filter thread on here, which is great because I use all 82mm ND filters. So all I have to do is put on a step-up ring and throw those 82mm filters on here for long explosions in particular. But at the end of the day, this is only my first time actually using the lens, and I think for me to make valid judgments about the vignetting performance and its overall performance, I do need more images with this. But vignetting is something that I am concerned about. I mean, I was not that thrilled with this lens's vignetting performance in those couple of photos. And to be honest with you, that's a major component when it comes to a lens's image quality, especially for landscape photography. But something else that we do need to understand about this lens is that it's only $580 for a full frame lens for the Nikon Z mount, and that's new, not even used. For example, something like the Nikon 14-30mm f4 comes in at around double this price point, and that's talking about used. So those are definitely some factors that we need to consider when we're thinking about this lens, because this is a third-party lens meant to be more of a budget type of lens. And this lens does hit a major gap in the Nikon Z lens lineup. I mean, having a fast wide-angle lens that's a prime, I mean, we haven't had that since the 14mm f2.8D, and that lens came out a really long time ago. Honestly, it's long overdue for Nikon to come out with a prime fast wide-angle lens. So having a 60mm f1.8 for Viltrox, this could solve a major gap for a lot of people when they want a wide-angle prime lens. And I'm glad I was able to get some testing out with another third-party brand, because the only third-party brands that I really trust when it comes to lenses is Tamron and Carl Zeiss. And obviously we have a different one here, Viltrox, and this is a company that I don't think I really trusted that much to begin with. So being able to test this out and see it in the flesh and be able to actually use it before making these preconceived notions of these brands, I think is important for me in particular, because I get to see what the performance actually looks like in a more objective sense. So I do need more extensive testing when it comes to this lens, but right now I can't really give you a definite recommendation or non-recommendation of this lens. That will come in the full review, which hopefully should be coming out in a couple of weeks, give or take. But yeah, guys, what do you guys think about the 16mm f1.8 from the Viltrox third-party lens manufacturer? I think it's a really interesting lens and may solve a lot of people's issues with the Nikon Z mount. Let me know what your thoughts are about this lens down in the comment section down below. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.